Hello and welcome to Minimise Debt, Maximise Cash with Top Service, where each episode we will give you tips on how to maximise your cash and minimise your debt in the construction industry. My name is Emma Reilly, Top Services CEO, Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Credit Management and current Advisory Council member representing trade credit. In this episode, Paula Swain of Kerns Legal Services explains what the Late Payment of Commercial Debt Act is and how it can be applied in your business. This is taken from a joint webinar we ran with the CICM about charging statutory late payment interest.
So when I was putting these together, I was thinking back to 1998 because we're here to talk about the Act which came in then. And it was the summer when this Act was actually passed and gained royal assent, and that was during France 98, lest we forget. And of course, we had the launch of Windows 98 as well. So it was a big year. Personally, I was also finishing law school and about to start my training contract to become a lawyer. So quite a long time ago now. I think it's 28 years and counting. So yes, it's been part of my professional life all that time. So we're talking about the Late Payment of Commercial Debts Interest Act 1998. Here it is, got a copy, which is in brief, an act to make provision with respect to interest on the late payment of certain debts arising under commercial contracts for the supply of goods or services. Now, this applies across the UK, so Scotland and Northern Ireland as well, but they have their own approach there. So always check in Scotland and Northern Ireland with your advisors as to this particular piece of legislation. So I like to think of the application of this particular piece of legislation in three ways. There's the Fleetwood Mac, go your own way approach. There's the hybrid approach. And then there's the full electric experience, the full Tesla approach. So what do I mean by that? So you have the Type A contract where the creditor chooses everything they want to include in their contract terms and conditions. So interest is chosen at the commercial rate. They specify charges for default. They include a term for us lawyers that we love, which is the indemnity for legal costs on recovery. And they usually specify a time period for payment terms, usually 30 days. Then you have the hybrid contract, the Type B, where they mix and match a bit of the Act and what they also want to do themselves. That includes interest at 8% above Bank of England base rate, fixed compensation sums mirroring the Act, which we'll talk about in a minute, reasonable or indemnity legal costs, depending on their commercial preference, and payment terms, usually specified again, 30 days, 60 days, depending. And then there's the Type C contract, where they don't say anything about late payment interest, charges or compensation, and they rely entirely upon the Act, knowing that they have qualifying debts, which we'll talk about in a minute. So there's no express term in their terms and conditions referencing the Act or their entitlements. They rely on the Act for interest, they rely on the Act for compensation, they rely on the Act for reasonable costs. And the payment terms are also determined by the Act or, in some cases, their own contract. So the big takeaway here is always look at your terms and conditions, always review your terms and conditions. So we have to think about when the Act applies. You have to have a contract. It has to be in the B2B space, so business to business. And business can include HM government, local and public authorities. But caution here on the NHS, they like to treat themselves differently. Anybody who does any work with the NHS will know that. So just a segue out there. We have to have a supply of goods or services or both. So obviously in the construction industry, it's mostly goods that are being supplied. There has to be a money consideration. That's lawyer speak for price payable. And sole traders can be liable under the Act to pay, but they can also charge interest as well. So always one to remember. There are certain excluded contracts under the Act. That would include employment contracts, contracts where there's a security, consumer credit agreement. So what does the Act do? It inserts an implied term into the contract, giving a creditor a right to simple interest on the price, a fixed sum, and reasonable costs of recovery. The above only applies to a qualifying debt. So you have to have a debt which is not defined by the Act, created by virtue of an obligation under a contract to which the Act applies to pay the whole or any part of the contract price, defined as the money consideration for the goods or services you're supplying. There's a big question out in the industry about multiple invoices. Some creditors like to apply the charges interest to each particular invoice. My caution there is to always check your terms and conditions, that there isn't anything that contradicts the Act itself. But in some cases, you can charge these sums per outstanding invoice because the invoice stands as what we call a qualifying debt. So you've got your qualifying debt, you've got your entitlement to interest. What is it? It's 8% plus the Bank of England base rate. And that rate is set by the Act twice a year. And it's first for 6 months and the second 6 months. And that's the period it normally runs from. Interest then runs from the day after the agreed payment date. And if there's no agreed payment date, the Act steps in. Again, if you're unsure, always take advice. I'm sure Emma and the team are looking at this on a daily basis. So interest under the Act ceases to run when the interest would cease to run if it were carried under an express contract term. Interest under an express term normally ends on the payment of the principal sum, so when you've paid that debt. Interest might be challenged due to creditor behaviour. For example, if you confuse the debtor or you're not invoicing for a considerable period of time. And we have seen examples where, for example, that 8% over base rate interest rate has been reduced down to something like 4% above base. So there can be a penalty there for the advantage of the debtor. Contractual interest could be challenged in court as not offering a substantial remedy. And that has been done in several cases over the last 28 years. As an active solicitor in this area, debt recovery litigation, I've not had a challenge from the other side about this. But there are cases on this area and rates have been pushed down to 4 and 5% above base has been upheld as providing a substantial remedy. So you've got your entitlement to interest, and that's the gatekeeper. You have to have interest running before you can go on to these next stages. So once interest begins to run, the creditor is entitled to a fixed sum according to the size of the debt. So think of our invoice. If it's below £1,000, you're entitled to a fixed sum of £40. If it's £1,000 above but less than £10,000, that sum is £70. And then the debt of £10,000 plus, that fixed sum is £100. So you can start to see in the background where if you've got multiple invoices and multiple values, some creditors will want to seek those additional sums per invoice. And then we go on to the reasonable cost of recovery. So if a fixed sum is payable, so again, you're going through these gates, the creditor has an implied contractual right to be paid the reasonable costs of recovering the debt, which are not met by the fixed sum. And the court is going to have the final say on this. So if I go back to the original conversation we were having, and I said that as a lawyer, I prefer to have a clause that says indemnity costs, is because indemnity costs will generally sweep in all of the legal costs that you've incurred. Whereas reasonable costs, it's up to the court to determine what that sum will be. So this could include expenses incurred instructing a lawyer or employing a debt collection agency. And I think the top service team may mention this in terms of their experience of the Act and the daily discussions they have for payment under reasonable costs. So it's useful to argue for if the claim is allocated to the small claims track or is likely to be allocated if it's less than £10,000 or during a mediation. It's another argument up your sleeve to try to recover some of your actually expended costs of trying to recover the debt. So debt sale and some other points here. So if your debt is sold or assigned to another entity, these rights can be assigned to, and therefore that can affect the value of what you're selling. So always bear that in mind. Also consider that once late payment charges are due, they remain owing if the debtor pays the principal debt only, and there's a 6-year limitation period. So you can still go after those additional sums even if you've been paid the principal debt. And an express interest clause can displace interest. So please bear that in mind. And finally, the government has proposed making the statutory interest rate mandatory, and the discussion on that started in July last year. So please watch for future updates.
If you have any questions, the webinar would have been an excellent place to ask them, as this is exactly what Paula did following this talk. But until we see you at the next webinar, do contact us on LinkedIn by searching for Top Service Limited, or myself, search for Emma Reilly Top Service. The correct spelling will be in the podcast episode notes. Also, do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, so never miss an episode. Bye bye from Top Service.